Look at your hands right now. Turn them over. Study your palms. 2,000 years ago, those hands would have determined your entire life, whether they were soft or calloused, whether they could read Greek or swing a pickaxe. In ancient Rome, your hands told people exactly what you were worth, and if you were one of the millions of enslaved people who built that civilization, your hands belonged to someone else. Legally, permanently, completely. You were not a person, you were a thing. A tool that happened to breathe. If you are using this to fall asleep, perfect. These stories have waited 2,000 years. They'll be here when you wake up. Subscribe and stick around. Tonight, we're going to do something most history books don't do. We're going to try to understand what it actually felt like. Not the politics of slavery, not the economics, the daily, grinding, physical reality of being owned by another human being in the most powerful civilization the ancient world had ever seen. Because here is the thing about ancient Rome. We remember the gladiators, we remember the emperors, we remember the roads and the aqueducts and the legions that conquered the known world. But we almost never talk about the people who actually built all of it. The millions of human beings who were bought, sold, worked, beaten, and discarded so that Rome could be Rome. At its peak, scholars estimate that somewhere between 20 and 40% of the population of the Roman Empire were enslaved. Think about that for a second. In a city of 1 million people, between 200,000 and 400,000 of them were property. They walked the same streets as senators and soldiers. They cooked the food, carried the water, cleaned the houses, tended the fields, and they had no legal rights whatsoever. Under Roman law, an enslaved person was classified as res mancipi, the same legal category as farmland and livestock. A farmer, a field, and a slave were all handled through the same property transfer process, the same paperwork, the same legal protections for the buyer. You could return a defective slave within 6 months, just like returning a lame horse. But here is where the story gets complicated, because Roman slavery wasn't one thing. It was 1,000 different things, depending on where you ended up, who bought you, and what skills you had. The gap between the best and worst fates was almost unimaginable. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start with how you became a slave in the first place. The most common path into slavery was war. When Rome conquered a territory, the survivors were considered spoils of victory, no different from gold or grain. After the fall of Epirus in 1967 BCE, 150,000 people were sold into slavery in a single day. 150,000 human beings, sorted and priced like cattle at a market. The Jewish historian Josephus recorded that after the Great Jewish Revolt in 66 to 70 CE, 97,000 people were enslaved. The future Emperor Vespasian personally sold over 30,000 captives from a single city. Those who were old or sick were simply executed on the spot. They had no market value. But war wasn't the only way in. Pirates raided coastal settlements throughout the Mediterranean, kidnapping entire families and selling them at massive slave markets. The island of Delos became the most notorious hub. Ancient sources claim that 10,000 enslaved people could be processed through Delos in a single day. The Cilician pirates, who supplied many of these markets, operated with near impunity for decades. You could also be born into it. Under Roman law, a child born to an enslaved mother was automatically a slave, regardless of who the father was. These children, called venae, were born into bondage and knew nothing else. Some masters actually bred their slaves deliberately, treating human reproduction as a business strategy for maintaining their workforce. And then there were the truly desperate cases. Roman fathers had the legal right to sell their own children into slavery if they needed the money. Abandoned infants left on roadsides could be collected by anyone and raised as slaves. Criminals convicted of serious offenses were condemned to slavery as punishment. Even free citizens who fell into crushing debt could be sold to cover what they owed. Now picture this. You've been captured in a war or kidnapped by pirates or sold by your own family. You've been marched in chains for days or weeks, and now you arrive at a slave market in Rome itself. What happens next is something that would haunt you for the rest of your life. The slave markets were regulated by officials called aediles. They operated like any other commercial market. Sales were documented. Bills of sale were witnessed. There were consumer protection laws, but the product being sold was human beings. When you arrived at the market, a placard called a titulus was hung around your neck. It listed your geographic origin, your age, your skills, any known health problems, and whether you had a history of running away or attempting suicide. The seller was legally required to disclose all defects. Concealing a flaw meant the buyer could return you within 6 months for a full refund, or within 12 months for a partial one. You would be displayed on a raised platform. Buyers could inspect you physically. They could ask you to move, to jump, to demonstrate your range of motion. Ancient sources describe buyers checking teeth, testing muscle tone, looking for signs of disease or hidden injuries. If you had been brought from overseas, your feet would be whitened with chalk to mark you as a foreign import. The prices varied enormously. An unskilled laborer might sell for around 2,000 sesterces, roughly equivalent to 2 years of a Roman soldier's wages. But a highly educated Greek slave who could teach philosophy, practice medicine, or manage complex financial accounts might fetch tens of thousands of sesterces. Beauty also commanded premium prices, especially for young women and boys destined for wealthy households. After the Macedonian Wars in the 2nd century BCE, so many captives flooded the market that prices crashed below 500 sesterces per person. Slavery became so cheap that even middle-class Roman families could afford 1 or 2 slaves. It wasn't just the wealthy. Ordinary shopkeepers, craftsmen, and farmers owned human beings. And this is where the story splits into very different paths. Because your fate as an enslaved person in Rome depended almost entirely on one thing: what kind of work you were assigned to do. Let's start with the worst. The absolute bottom of the hierarchy, the mines. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus described conditions in the silver and gold mines of Roman Spain, and his account is one of the most disturbing passages in ancient literature. He wrote that the slaves who worked in those mines wore out their bodies both by day and by night in the diggings under the earth, dying in large numbers because of the exceptional hardships they endured. No respite or pause was granted to them in their labor. Children were commonly used in the mines because their small bodies could crawl through narrow tunnels that adults couldn't fit through. The ventilation was almost non-existent. Poisonous gases accumulated in the deeper shafts. Cave-ins were frequent. The life expectancy for a mine slave could be measured in months, not years. Diodorus wrote that death in their eyes was more to be desired than life because of the magnitude of the hardships they must bear. Think about that. These were people who preferred death to another day of work, and Rome kept sending more of them down into the darkness. Being sentenced to the mines was called damnatio ad mortale, and it was considered only slightly less severe than a death sentence, because that is essentially what it was. And then there were the gladiators. The men who fought and died for public entertainment were, with few exceptions, enslaved people. They were purchased by the owners of training schools called ludi and put through a brutal regimen designed to turn them into professional killers. The training was harsh. The discipline was absolute. And the end result was a human being engineered to die spectacularly in front of a cheering crowd. Some gladiators became celebrities. Their names were scratched as graffiti on walls throughout Pompeii. Women swooned over them. But celebrity didn't change what they were. They were slaves who had been given swords instead of plowshares. Their bodies still belonged to someone else. Their deaths still generated profit for their owners. A successful gladiator could eventually earn a wooden sword called a rudis, which symbolized their freedom. One inscription tells of a gladiator who received the rudis 4 times but kept returning to the arena. Perhaps the fame was worth the risk, or perhaps freedom meant nothing when fighting was the only skill you had been allowed to learn. But the mines weren't the only nightmare. The agricultural estates, the latifundia that fed Rome's enormous appetite for grain, wine, and olive oil, were worked by armies of enslaved laborers, and the conditions there could be almost as brutal. Agricultural slaves, known as vincti, were typically housed in underground barracks called ergastula. These were essentially prisons beneath the farmhouse. The Roman writer Columella described them as deep, roofed pits below ground level, with narrow sleeping spaces and windows set high in the walls, with bars too small to reach. The slaves inside were often kept in chains, even while they slept. The Roman statesman Cato the Elder wrote extensively about how to manage agricultural slaves. His advice was chillingly practical. He recommended providing each slave with a specific food ration, measured precisely. A tunic and a cloak every 2 years, wooden shoes once a year. When slaves became too old or too sick to work, his advice was simple: sell them. Cut your losses, replace them with younger, healthier stock. The philosopher Plutarch, writing centuries later, found this attitude revolting. He criticized Cato for treating his slaves worse than beasts of burden, using them to the uttermost, and then driving them off and selling them when they were old. But Cato's approach was common. Agricultural slaves were tools. When a tool breaks, you get a new one. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii confirmed the horror. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it preserved everything in volcanic ash, including the bodies of enslaved workers. Archaeologists found groups of slaves chained together in death as they had been in life. Their skeletons showed chronic arthritis and skeletal deformations that could only have been produced by extreme overwork and severe malnutrition over many years. The Emperor Augustus eventually ordered inspections of Ergastula after reports that free citizens traveling through the countryside were being illegally kidnapped and imprisoned in them alongside actual slaves. Think about what that tells you. These underground prisons were so numerous and so hidden that people could disappear into them and never be found. But here is the thing. Not all slavery in Rome looked like this. And this is where the story becomes genuinely complicated. Because at the other end of the spectrum, some enslaved people lived lives that looked nothing like what we just described. Wealthy Roman households employed vast numbers of domestic slaves, and the range of roles was extraordinary. There were cooks, cleaners, gardeners, hairdressers, and personal attendants. But there were also accountants, secretaries, librarians, and tutors. Some enslaved people served as doctors, treating their master's family, and sometimes running what amounted to private medical practices. Greek slaves were particularly valued for their education. A Greek enslaved tutor might teach a Roman senator's children philosophy, literature, mathematics, and rhetoric. These slaves often lived in relative comfort, ate well, and were treated as valuable members of the household. Some became so trusted that they managed their master's entire financial affairs, handling investments, collecting debts, and running businesses. And then there were the public slaves, the servi publici, who belonged not to individual masters, but to the Roman state itself. No fewer than 700 enslaved people were employed just to maintain the capital's water supply, keeping the massive aqueduct system functioning. Others worked as clerks, tax collectors, road builders, and administrators. Some public slaves had more autonomy than many free citizens. The emperor's personal household, the Familia Caesaris, employed thousands of enslaved people in roles that amounted to running the imperial bureaucracy. Some of these imperial slaves wielded more real power than senators. They controlled access to the emperor, managed state finances, and influenced policy decisions. Their technical status as property was almost irrelevant to the actual power they held. The philosopher Seneca argued passionately that enslaved people should be treated with dignity. He described the cruelty he witnessed in wealthy households. Slaves forced to stand in silence during elaborate banquets, one slave mopping up vomit from guests who had eaten too much, another crouching beneath the table to collect scraps. The slightest cough, hiccup, or sneeze was punished with a beating. Even in the best circumstances, domestic slaves lived under constant threat. A master had absolute power. In the early republic, slave owners could legally kill their slaves for any reason or no reason at all. Later imperial laws restricted this right, but enforcement was nearly impossible. Who would a slave complain to? Their testimony couldn't even be accepted in court unless it was extracted under torture. The cruelty could be breathtaking. Vettius Pollio, a wealthy Roman of the 1st century BCE, was infamous for punishing disobedient slaves by throwing them into a pool of flesh-eating eels called lampreys. The practice was so outrageous that even Emperor Augustus condemned it, but Augustus didn't free Pollio's slaves. He just broke Pollio's goblets, so he couldn't use the punishment again. The system protected masters from their own worst excesses, not to help slaves, but to maintain social order. One of the most chilling laws in Roman history concerned the murder of a master by a slave. If any enslaved person killed their owner, every single slave in the household was to be executed. Not just the guilty individual, every last one. In 14 CE, the senator Lucius Pedanius Secundus was murdered by one of his slaves. 400 enslaved people in his household were condemned to death. The Senate debated the sentence, but ultimately upheld it. 400 people killed for the actions of one. The message was clear. Slaves were collectively responsible for their master's safety. If you saw a fellow slave plotting violence, you had every incentive to report them. The system was designed to turn the enslaved against each other. Now, there is one question that people always ask about Roman slavery, and it is worth spending some time on. Could you get out? Was there any escape from this life? The answer is yes, but the path was narrow, uncertain, and filled with conditions that kept you bound to your former master even after you were technically free. Running away was the most obvious option, and many tried, but the entire Roman legal and social system was designed to catch you. Escaped slaves were actively hunted. Rewards were offered. Neighbors were expected to report suspicious strangers. If you were caught, the punishments were severe: whipping, branding on the forehead with the letters FUG for fugitivus, being forced to wear a heavy metal collar inscribed with your owner's name and address, or being sold to an even worse master, to the mines, to the gladiatorial arena. The legal path to freedom was called manumission, and this was one of the most remarkable aspects of Roman slavery. It was also one of the most psychologically devious. A master could free a slave in several ways. The most formal involved a ceremony before a magistrate, where an official would touch the slave with a special rod called a vindicta. The slave's head would be shaved, and they would receive a felt cap called a pileus, which became the symbol of freedom. The master could also free slaves in their will, or simply register them as free citizens in the census. But here is what made manumission so effective as a tool of control. The mere possibility of freedom kept slaves obedient. You didn't need to beat a slave into submission if you could dangle the promise of liberty in front of them. Work hard, stay loyal, don't cause trouble, and someday, maybe, you'll be free. Some slaves were allowed to accumulate a small fund of savings called a peculium. Technically, this money still belonged to the master, but in practice, slaves could use it to eventually purchase their own freedom. The prices were steep. You might spend decades saving, and there was always the risk that your master would simply take the money back. But the hope itself was enough to prevent most people from revolting. The numbers tell an interesting story. Scholars estimate that slaves in the emperor's household were typically freed around age 30 to 35. For slaves in private households, the odds were much lower. Manual laborers on agricultural estates had almost no hope of manumission. The promise of freedom was real for some and a cruel illusion for many others. When freedom did come, it wasn't quite what you might imagine. A freed slave, called a libertus, became a Roman citizen. That sounds remarkable, but the freedom came with strings, thick, heavy, permanent strings. As a freedman, you were required to maintain a relationship with your former master, who became your patron. You owed them obsequium, a general deference and respect, and you owed them opere, specific labor obligations. You might still work for your former owner. You still couldn't testify against them in court. You were barred from holding public office. The social stigma never fully washed off, but your children would be full Roman citizens without any of those restrictions. The poet Horace was the son of a freedman. The historian Tacitus claimed that most knights and even many senators were descended from former slaves. Within a generation or two, the stain of slavery could be erased from your family line. Not from your own life, but from the lives of those who came after you, and some freedmen became spectacularly wealthy. The fictional Trimalchio, from Petronius's novel The Satyricon, was a vulgar, boastful, fabulously rich former slave who threw outrageous banquets. He was a satire, but he was based on real people. Some freedmen accumulated fortunes that rivaled the old aristocracy. A former slave named Gaius Caecilius Isidorus eventually owned over 4,000 slaves of his own. The irony is staggering. A person who was once property could become a property owner. A person who was once bought and sold could buy and sell others. The system didn't produce abolitionists. It produced people who wanted to be on the other side of the transaction. But we shouldn't let the stories of successful freedmen distract us from the reality that most enslaved people in Rome faced. Because for every Trimalchio, there were thousands of anonymous human beings who lived and died in chains, whose names were never recorded, whose stories were never told. Let's talk about the moments that no ancient historian bothered to write down. Because the famous sources tell us about laws and economics and great revolts, but they rarely tell us what a Tuesday afternoon felt like for an enslaved person in Rome. You owned nothing, not even the tunic on your back. You couldn't legally marry. You could form a relationship that Romans called contubernium, a sort of informal partnership, but it had no legal standing. Your partner could be sold away from you at any moment. Your children could be taken and sold. There was nothing you could do about it. You ate what your master provided. Cato prescribed a specific diet for his agricultural slaves. About 4 pounds of bread per Dalton Y when the work was heavy, less when it was light. Some figs, olives, cheap wine diluted with water, enough to keep you working, not enough to keep you healthy. The average life expectancy for an enslaved person in Rome has been estimated at around 17.5 years. Compare that to roughly 40 years for a free citizen. Half a life. That number tells you everything you need to know about the physical toll of slavery in Rome. You could be punished for almost anything. Whipping was routine. Branding was common. Crucifixion was reserved for the most serious offenses, particularly running away or violence against a master. The cross and the whip were the symbols of Roman slavery. They hung over every interaction, every moment of every day, and sexual exploitation was pervasive and completely legal. A master had total rights over the bodies of their slaves. Male and female slaves alike were subject to their owner's desires. There was no concept of consent. There was no crime being committed. You were property. Property doesn't get to say no. Think about the psychological weight of that. Every single day, you woke up knowing that everything about your life was controlled by someone else. When you ate, what you wore, where you went, who you spoke to, whether you lived or died. There was no private self. No inner life that your master couldn't violate. The Roman philosopher Varro classified slaves alongside cattle and farm equipment. He called them speaking tools. That was the category, mute tools like carts and plows, semi-mute tools like oxen and horses, and speaking tools. Slaves. One of the most insidious aspects of Roman slavery was how thoroughly it permeated everyday life. Slavery wasn't something that happened in designated spaces, hidden from view. It was everywhere in every household, on every street, at every dinner party and religious festival and public building. The enslaved and the free walked the same roads, breathed the same air, lived in the same houses. And yet one group was human and the other was property. The Roman Senate once debated whether slaves should be required to wear distinctive clothing so that they could be identified on sight. The proposal was rejected, but not because senators cared about the dignity of enslaved people. It was rejected because they were terrified of what would happen if the slaves could see how many of them there were. That fear was well-founded because enslaved people did fight back. They always fought back. The most famous rebellion began in 73 BCE at a gladiatorial training school in Capua, about 100 miles south of Rome. A group of roughly 70 gladiators, armed with nothing but kitchen implements, fought their way out of the compound. Their leader was a man named Spartacus. What happened next shook Rome to its core. Spartacus and his band fled to Mount Vesuvius. Rome sent 3,000 militia to surround them and wait them out. Spartacus had his men weave ropes from wild grapevines and rappel down an unguarded cliff face in the middle of the night. They attacked the Roman camp from behind and destroyed it. Word spread. Slaves from across the countryside fled their masters and joined the growing rebellion. Within months, the army of escaped slaves numbered in the tens of thousands. Some estimates put the total at over 120,000 men, women, and children. They defeated every Roman force sent against them. Trained legions led by consuls fell before an army of former slaves. For 2 years, Spartacus and his followers roamed Italy, raiding estates, freeing slaves, and humiliating the most powerful military machine in the ancient world. Nobody knows exactly what Spartacus wanted. The ancient sources disagree. Some say he planned to march his people north across the Alps to freedom. Others say he considered marching on Rome itself. In the end, the wealthy Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus was given command of 40,000 troops to crush the rebellion. After a campaign of brutal discipline and strategic encirclement, Crassus trapped Spartacus in the toe of Italy. Spartacus died in the final battle. His body was never found, but the aftermath was designed to be unforgettable. 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome. Their bodies lined over 100 miles of highway, a message carved in flesh and wood and iron. This is what happens when you resist. The Spartacus revolt wasn't the first slave rebellion in Roman history. There had been 2 previous servile wars in Sicily, in 1935 to 1932 and 104 to 100 BCE. Both were massive. Both were crushed. But Spartacus was different because he threatened Italy itself. He showed that the enslaved population, if united, could challenge Rome's military supremacy. The first servile war in Sicily involved roughly 70,000 enslaved workers who seized control of large portions of the island and held it for nearly 4 years. The Second Servile War saw similar numbers. These were not small uprisings. These were full-scale military campaigns that required Rome to deploy legions to suppress. The agricultural estates of Sicily were worked by some of the most brutally treated slaves in the Roman world, and the revolts that erupted from those estates were proportional to the suffering that created them. But here is something remarkable about all 3 servile wars. None of them were fought to end slavery. The rebel slaves didn't develop an ideology that said owning human beings was wrong. They fought for their own freedom, not for a principle. The concept that slavery itself was inherently immoral simply didn't exist in the ancient world. It was as natural to the Romans as gravity. After Spartacus, Rome never faced another major slave revolt. But the fear never went away, and that fear shaped everything about how Romans managed their enslaved population for the next 5 centuries. As the empire matured, the laws around slavery began to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Emperor Claudius ruled that 6 slaves who were abandoned by their masters would be granted freedom. Hadrian made it illegal to sell slaves to gladiatorial schools or to brothels without their consent. He also banned the ergastula, those underground prison barracks on the agricultural estates. Antoninus Pius declared that a master who killed a slave without justification was guilty of homicide. It was the first time Roman law explicitly recognized that enslaved people had a right to life that could override their master's property rights. Progress, slow, insufficient, inadequate progress. But progress nonetheless. The philosopher Seneca, writing in the 1st century CE, made arguments that were radical for his time. He insisted that enslaved people were human beings first and property second. He urged masters to eat with their slaves, to treat them as humble friends, to remember that fortune could just as easily have reversed their positions. But Seneca was an outlier, and even he owned slaves. His philosophy didn't lead him to free the people he held in bondage. It just led him to suggest that the bondage should be more comfortable. The moral contradictions of Roman slavery never produced an abolitionist movement. Nobody argued that the institution itself was wrong. The best minds of Rome simply argued that cruelty was unnecessary. As the empire entered its later centuries, slavery gradually transformed rather than disappeared. Economic shifts made large-scale slave labor less profitable. The supply of war captives diminished as Rome's borders stabilized. Christianity spread through the empire, and while the Church never condemned slavery outright, its teachings about the equality of souls before God planted seeds that would take centuries to grow. Agricultural slaves gradually became tied to the land rather than to individual owners. By the 4th century, they couldn't be sold separately from the property they worked. They could marry, acquire possessions, and pass them to their children. They were still not free, but the chains had loosened enough that they looked more like what medieval Europe would later call serfs. The system didn't end with a declaration or a war. It dissolved slowly into something different, something that was still deeply unjust, but something that at least acknowledged that the people doing the work were, in fact, people. And here is the part that should keep you up at night. Even if you are trying to fall asleep right now, we know the names of almost none of them. Out of millions of enslaved people who built the roads you can still walk on today, who constructed the aqueducts that still stand across Europe, who grew the grain that fed an empire of 60 million people, we have a handful of names. Mostly from tombstones paid for by grateful masters. Mostly from legal documents, recording transactions. But there are exceptions. In the mountain town of Pietrabondante, more than 100 miles east of Rome, archaeologists discovered something remarkable on the roof of an ancient temple. Clay tiles bearing the fingerprints of the workers who made them, and on 2 of those tiles, someone had scratched their names. Debt-free, slave of Herennius Satius, and Amica, slave of Herennius. 2 names scratched into wet clay on a rooftop where nobody would ever look. A tiny subversive act of defiance. A way of saying I was here, I existed. Remember me. Those fingerprints are 2,000 years old. The people who made them are dust. But their names survived, hidden in plain sight, carried by the wind and the rain and the gods and the birds. As one historian put it, until someone finally found them and read them aloud again. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder observed that underneath the marble and the glory, Rome was built on the backs of human beings who had no choice in the matter. The roads that connected an empire, the buildings that housed a civilization, the food that fed the greatest city the ancient world had ever known, all of it produced by people who were treated as less than human, and yet who remained stubbornly, irrevocably human. If you are still with us, thank you, and if you are drifting off, that is fine too. These stories have survived for 2 millennia. They'll survive one more night. Next time you look at a photograph of the Colosseum or the Roman Forum or those incredible aqueducts, remember that you are looking at a monument to human suffering as much as human achievement. Every stone was placed by someone, and most of those someones had no choice. Their names are mostly lost. Their stories were never written down, but their fingerprints are still there, pressed into the clay and the stone, and the mortar of a civilization that called them things but could never quite make them stop being people. Subscribe and stick around, and sleep well tonight, because somewhere in the ruins of the ancient world, in clay tiles on forgotten rooftops, in chains still locked around bones buried beneath Italian farmland, the evidence of millions of lives is still waiting, still hoping that someone someday will say their names.